Every American school child knows that we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But of these three rights, which is the most important, the most central? One of Will Smith's latest movies suggests that it is the pursuit of happiness, but of course spells happiness with a Y rather than an I in an attempt to be either witty or profound. Others suggest that our central right is the right to life, that life must be protected in all forms and at all costs. This is clearly the driving assumption of groups such as pro-life, PETA, and so on. It's not often, however, that we encounter a group, movie, or even individual that proposes liberty to be the most basic and important of our rights. Today, then, I hope to introduce you to such a group of people who do. A group aptly named Libertarians. Libertarianism, while certainly an ethical standpoint built around respecting our right to liberty, is more specifically a political standpoint built around such a respect. In this regard, libertarianism is unique among the ethical systems we have been discussing this semester. Indeed, if you were to run for political office, you couldn't run under the Kantian Party because, thank God, the Kantian Party does not exist. Kantianism is not a political standpoint. However, you could run under the Libertarian Party. Libertarianism is fundamentally political. You should thus keep this in mind, this political orientation, that is, throughout today's presentation. In our reading for today, the libertarian thinker Robert Nozick makes some basic assumptions. Now, if you are, as I would hope, beginning to develop a critical eye, you might start to question any such assumptions. Indeed, you might reason. Philosophers are not supposed to assume anything. They are supposed to offer arguments to support their claims. Now, this is true, but like everything else, I hope to complicate this issue for you a bit. Namely, you should note that all philosophers necessarily make assumptions with every argument. They assume, for example, that language works, that their definition of terms is correct, and so on. Therefore, even though Nozick does make some assumptions in our reading for today, I would like to propose that this is not necessarily a reason to discredit him. So then, what are these assumptions? Basically, they are this. All people have rights, and these rights must never be violated. This assumption is largely based on Nozick's conviction that Kant is correct, that people must always be treated as ends rather than as means, and that rights ensure that we are treated as such. If you're a little rusty on Kant and having a hard time seeing how this works, remember that for Kant, a means is a way of achieving a goal, while an end is the goal we are trying to achieve. Therefore, if, like many philosophers, you wind up flipping burgers somewhere, your spatula is the means to the end of a good burger. You use your spatula in order to achieve the goal of a perfect patty. Now what rights do, or as Nozick is suggesting, is protect people from being treated as a means, as being treated like the spatula. Consider the right to a trial. This right ensures that we won't be punished simply to set an example or clean up the streets. Indeed, the right ensures that we are tried on an individual basis for only our own crimes. It ensures we are treated as an end, not a means. Therefore, as people must always be treated as ends, and as rights ensure this treatment, we must never violate rights. If Nozick is thus correct that our rights can never be violated because they ensure that people are always treated as ends, then it is clear that we must work to promote rights. How to do this? Nozick suggests that there are two ways, one active, one passive. First, we could actively attempt to secure rights for as many people as possible. We could treat rights, in other words, like the greatest good and try to increase their presence in the world. Second, we could attempt passively to promote rights, simply by keeping ourselves from infringing on the rights of others. In other words, we could treat rights as constraints on our own action. Let's see what Nozick thinks about these options. As far as securing rights for as many people as possible, Nozick thinks this option, to put it bluntly, stinks like a dead skunk in the road. The stench is for two reasons. First, if we try to secure rights for as many people as possible, we are going to end up violating certain individuals' rights. Consider, for instance, Farmer Bob. Farmer Bob hasn't made acres of land, tractors, combines, 7 silos, the works. However, there's also a group of peasants in town. Now, if we were attempting to secure rights for as many people as possible, we would clearly have to sacrifice probably even most of Farmer Bob's property, his right to property, for the sake of the peasant's right to property. We would have to redistribute his land, share the wealth. Therefore, the attempt to promote rights would lead to their very violation. We also see that attempting to secure rights for everyone leads to treating people as ends rather than as means. Indeed, in the above example, poor old Bob is walked all over so that everyone can have the right to property. Bob, in other words, is being treated as a means, not as an end. True, he is being treated as a means to the end of securing rights, but a means nonetheless. Therefore, securing rights for everyone leads to treating people as means rather than as ends, thus violating the very thing rights are meant to ensure. Luckily, then, there is another way we can go about promoting rights, namely the passive way. We can promote rights simply by refusing to infringe on the rights of others. We can treat rights, in other words, as a set of constraints on our own actions, as limiting how we are allowed to interact with other people. Now this, Nozick says, is what I'm talking about. You see, this way of promoting rights avoids all the things that go wrong when we try to actively secure rights for people. First of all, when we treat rights as constraints, we will never wind up messing with one person's rights for the sake of another. Think again about our old pal, Farmer Bob, and the peasants in town. If we approach this situation simply with the goal of refusing to interfere with the rights of others, we will never think of taking away Bob's land, as doing so would interfere with his rights. It is irrelevant that such an action would secure rights for the peasants, as securing rights is not the point. Refraining from interfering with rights is the point. What this means, then, is that when we treat rights as constraints, people will never be treated as means rather than as ends. Indeed, on this view, there is no greater good, such as rights for everyone, that must be attained. The only good is individual rights. Therefore, there is no reason for the individual to be used as a means to some end, even if that end is something like rights for everyone. When we treat rights as constraints, it therefore seems that rights are best promoted. Under this treatment, rights are never violated. However, treating rights as constraints also has a rather radical implication. Namely, all of our rights end up boiling down to the right to liberty. As we can see from Farmer Bob's example, the only right that either Farmer Bob or the peasants have is the right to liberty, the right to not being messed with. Indeed, the reason we don't take away Farmer Bob's property is not really that he has a right to property, but rather that he has a right to be left alone. This is also why we do not owe the peasants any land to live on. They do not have the right to property any more than Farmer Bob does. They only have the right to their own liberty, which, of course, is not infringed upon by letting Farmer Bob keep his farm. This, then, is why libertarianism has the name that it does. Indeed, for Nozick, as for all libertarians, our rights ultimately boil down to a single one, the right to liberty. Up until this point, I've been speaking about rights in terms of individuals relating to each other, specifically a make-believe farmer with a stereotypical name and a group of medieval-style peasants. There's a problem with this, and not just because such a combination of figures violates the chronology of any known history. Indeed, the deeper problem with my description of libertarianism is that, as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, this school of thought is not merely an ethical standpoint, but a political one. For a full understanding of libertarianism, in other words, we must understand what it means for a government to be libertarian, that is, to respect and protect our single right, our right to liberty. Well, says Nozick, it's not actually hard to figure out what this means. First of all, a libertarian government will be justified in stepping in when an individual's right to liberty is violated. For instance, if the peasants from our far too drawn-out example were to take over Farmer Bob's farm, the government could step in and help old Bob out. However, Nozick continues, this is the only instance in which the government would be justified in acting. Indeed, a libertarian government could never justify stepping into individuals' affairs that don't involve explicit violations of liberty. It could not interfere with trade, with food, with healthcare, with life, with death, or anything else of the sort. A libertarian government, in short, would be but a single step from anarchy, would be what Nozick refers to as an ultra-minimal state. This, then, covers libertarianism. I have also asked you to read, however, some of the documents that deal with rights in a very different manner, namely the Bill of Rights and Declaration of Independence. These documents ensure that as Americans we have various rights, including, but not limited to, the right to life, liberty, a fair trial, and representative government. Now, we do not have the time here to fully analyze these documents. I thus hope that you do so yourself. Still, however, it seems appropriate, by way of closing, to offer some very brief thoughts on them. First of all, then, I do not see how one could even begin to philosophically defend most of the rights guaranteed to us by the Bill of Rights and Declaration of Independence. Perhaps we could offer a defense to our right to liberty, but I think that it would be rather impossible to philosophically defend the right, for example, to representative government. This noted, I wonder whether the philosophical viability of these rights is in fact what they are all about.